I think I mentioned in that last nugget that this is one of those Microsoft exams where you can really overthink the objectives. And if you find yourself just really digging down into a rat hole of depth when it comes to the content you think that you need in order to pass the exam, you might step back just a bit because you really want to spend some time looking at the individual objectives to help you tailor what you need to study for. And it is this first nugget where we talk about Active Directory, and the title of the nugget is Configure a Forest or a Domain, where it is a perfect example of exactly how deep you can see that rabbit hole go. In this nugget, we have three different objectives that we need to talk about, and these three are, we need to talk about them at a high level, but not at a level of detail that you might think if you start really kind of analyzing what you need to know. You have already gone through the process of configuring an Active Directory domain. You've installed one back in 70-410 and 70-411. So you know how to deal with Active Directory. You know how to create domain controllers. And so I don't need to show you the process to build a domain controller or even to connect one domain controller to another. But what you do need to know are just the very basics of some of the design things, the decisions that you'll make that are associated with implementing multiple domain infrastructures, configurations, and multiple forest configurations here with Active Directory. Most importantly, also, it's necessary for you to recognize when you have to connect these forests together. Well, how do you do so with previous versions of Active Directory? Now, it's here where I can give you just a little bit of advice based off of, I think, every single other Microsoft exam that has happened in the history of Microsoft exams. Recognize that Microsoft with these exams is trying to teach you on today's technologies. And so while they are here talking a bit about previous versions of Active Directory, you can probably guess that the questions are at least subtly going to try to focus you in on many of the answers being get yourself to Server 2012 R2. You can see here that our second objective is just talking about upgrading existing domains and forests and the process that you need to go through in order to accomplish that. There's a multiple step process that these days is fairly well understood in order to get those Active Directory environments upgraded. They are by no means trivial, but at least they're understood at this point because a lot of us have now gone through multiple Active Directory upgrades from 2000 or NT to 2000, 2003, 2008, and so on. And we have one third objective here, which is literally a single dialog box that you need to be aware of. You need to know why it's there and then where you actually punch in those different user principal names if you end up needing them for authentication. So let's begin and have just a conversation before we even get into looking at any demonstrations, because I don't have much in the way of demonstration for this nugget. I want to take a step back from looking at screens here because, again, this is kind of the very beginnings of a design task when we start thinking about how to implement these multiple domain and multiple forest Active Directory environments. When we're building our Active Directory environments these days, I'm doing this, I'm recording this video in 2014. We've been doing Active Directory for a very long period of time. And so as a consequence, the many years that have elapsed since the introduction of Active Directory, the single domain model, company .pri being a single domain, a single forest, is perhaps the most common of the Active Directory configurations that you're going to find out in the wild. And really, compared to previous exam certifications, you think about the MCSE back in Windows 2000, 2003 in the early days, the test questions that relate to anything else other than single forest, single domain are relatively small in number. Microsoft is not trying to tell you that you can go about creating giant domain configurations because, well, these days, I think everyone's realized that, it's just easiest to create single forest, single domain. When you're thinking about configuring these, there is kind of just a process that you will go through for understanding how you connect these things together. I'll start with the multi-domain environment where I have a single forest that has multiple domains. One of the things you have to think about these days is the recognition that we can have disjointed namespaces when we're building our multiple domain Active Directory environments. So if this is company1.com up here at the top, it's very possible to have company2.com and even company2-2.com as domains that exist below the root level domain. When I create these second level domains, I can create either contiguous or non-contiguous namespaces as well. So down from here, so c2.com, I can create additional domains here called, oh, I don't know, test.c2.com and production.c2.com and so on and so forth. These domains, when you're creating a multiple domain environment that exists in a single forest, one of the best reasons to accomplish this is because all the necessary trusts are automatically created and laid into place for you to make these things work with each other. Now you'll notice I can create a very complex infrastructure here where I have, 2 domain controllers up here and 2 domain controllers up down here and 2 here and all the way up and down this tree. When I create these multiple domain environments, the trusts are indeed in place, but it is entirely possible for me to create some really strange interconnections between a user, for example, that is in this domain, test.c2.com, that needs to access resources in a completely different domain on some other side of the tree. Now, we'll talk more about trusts and the implications of setting up these trusts and different kinds of trusts that exist. But for now, just recognize it, just for this nugget, that when you're creating a multiple domain environment inside of a forest, you can do so and have non-contiguous namespaces. You can do so as you drill deeper, create contiguous namespaces. So again, test.c2.com and production.c2.com. And you're generally going to create these because you have some organizational need to accomplish them. Now, I told you to introduce this topic that today out in the wild, the most common of these Active Directory environments is single forest, single domain. So you may be asking, okay, Greg, well, when does it actually make sense for me to go about creating something that is more complex than that single forest, single domain model? And typically the reasons these days have very little to do with technology. In the old days, we created separations here, perhaps because my admin in one location didn't trust the admin in some other location. Or the root domain up here at the top was where we stored our user accounts, and then our resources existed in some resource domain one level down. A lot of the content these days, or a lot of the knowledge coming out of Microsoft, is kind of eschewing this original separation of resources because the management tasks associated with building these multi-domain environments just gets really ridiculous, and having to put objects from one domain, like computer accounts in one domain, into groups in another domain can become really overwhelming. But there are a variety of typically organizational-based reasons why you would create a multi-domain Active Directory environment. Not the least of which, number one, being you just have always done that. Your history of your environment has suggested that, you know what, we just like having multiple domains because the people down in Phoenix, we don't want them dealing with our stuff. The historical reason is it's no less valid, but it's not necessarily a technical reason why you would create those multiple domain environments. When I say history too, I also like to think about organizational reasons or also really political reasons. Talking about the administrator in one location that doesn't really trust the administrator in another organization. That is absolutely an organizational or a political reason to create multiple domains. You just don't want to deal with their resources and they don't want to deal with yours. The third of which are, and this is much more minimized these days, but the third of which are security reasons. And remember first that a domain is intended to be a boundary of authentication and authorization, right? You create a boundary, so you have this hard edge that surrounds the authentication of a user or a resource, and then the authorization or the privileges that you associate to that user or that resource. These days, there are a lot of nice technologies that can really improve the process of keeping people separated. We will talk about some of those here in this series, like dynamic access control, like Active Directory Federation services. In many cases, these environments or these technologies are perhaps superior than the large amount of complexity that you'll be creating in a multi-domain environment. So I'm going to punt on some of the security reasons because I think it will make more sense as we start to delve into DAC and we delve into Active Directory Federation services a little bit later in this series. Now there are going to be some reasons for you to create a multiple forest model. And so we're not talking here about domains that exist in a domain hierarchy, but two completely separate forests. So perhaps, for example, we have our company one here.com. And company1.com ends up buying bobsbiscuitfactory.com. Now, although these are separate namespaces, right? I've got company1.com here on this side, and I've got Bob's Biscuit Factory over here on this side. They're separate namespaces, but they are indeed forests of their own. When Bob's Biscuit Factory created its own Active Directory infrastructure, it created its own forest. And so when Company One ends up buying out the Biscuit Factory, there really isn't a mechanism for you to just simply drag this entire forest underneath the existing forest that you have. So separate in your mind the difference between being able to have separate namespaces and just how these organizational infrastructures got created in the first place. Let's go back again. Let's think about the process where Company One and Bob's Biscuit Factory end up merging for one reason or another. Because of that, I end up having what will eventually become a multiple forest model. In this multiple forest model, there may be domains that exist sub to these top-level domains, and I don't really know or particularly even care what domains exist below here. And a lot of times there aren't. But in order to be able to use resources or authenticate to resources from one forest to the other, the way in which we accomplish that is by manually creating a trust between the two forests. So here, this is kind of the way in which we describe how we create these trusts. But this trust, which is, again, a topic we'll talk about here, I think, in a couple of nuggets. This trust is the mechanism that says we in company1.com trust the organization Bob's Biscuit Factory. It does nothing for authorization, nothing for actually authorizing you to access the resources in the other forest. That comes later after the trust is established. But this is the top-level association between these two forests so that you can end up beginning the process of sharing resources between the two. Now, typically, the multiple forest model happens for a very discrete set of reasons. A couple of them are organizational. Some of them are actually technical in nature. Now, the first we talked about is, in a merger situation, merger or an acquisitions situation. So again, your company, company1.com, has bought a biscuit factory, and you all have your own forests. You need to get these forests connected together so you can share resources. That's one very common reason, and it's typically a temporary reason because eventually, more often than not, a lot of people just end up taking those resources and merging them back into the parent domain at some point. The other two reasons that exist for having multiple forests are more technical in nature. One is the need for multiple AD schemas. Now, this might not necessarily be an entire organization, so the entire company and the entire biscuit factory working together. But in situations where you have a separate forest structure, that maybe it's for developers, or maybe you're working on some piece of code, or maybe it has specific security requirements because you're storing sensitive data. In these reasons, you may have a different Active Directory schema itself. And when that schema needs to be different than that of your primary forest, well, then you create multiple forests and multiple forest trusts. Remember, we're not talking about the objects in the database, we're talking about the structure of the database itself. The last of these is the need for more than one exchange organization. And this is one that can commonly kind of come to bite you in the end. A lot of people don't realize that when you create an exchange organization, that exchange organization functions for the forest. There can be only one exchange organization per forest. And if there are situations where you need to create multiple exchange organizations, well, then you're going to need to have multiple forests. So multiple domain model, important. A lot of times they're done for mainly organizational reasons. The forest model, the multiple forest model, tends to be done for mergers, acquisitions, or for more technical reasons. Now, curiously, and this is a bit of a side note, there are some very interesting permissions, different rights and privileges that are required in order to build different forest or domain structures. And this is something you might want to know, actually, because it's one of those sort of trivia things that a lot of us don't realize until we actually need the perms. But in order to build a brand new forest, you need to be local admin on what will be the first domain controller. And if I'm going to build a brand new forest, I have no forest, so local admin is the only thing I have to have. To build a new domain tree or to build a child domain, you actually have to be an enterprise admin to accomplish that. So if I want to add on an additional domain onto a forest that I have to be an enterprise admin in order to accomplish that. That's something that a lot of people kind of forget, because in order to change the structure of the forest, you want to have the top level permissions. And it's one of the very few things that the enterprise admin privileges are actually required for. Adding additional domain controllers inside of a domain. So if I have one domain controller, there's to two, and I want to add in a third, I only have to be a domain admin. I don't have to be an enterprise admin. So useful kind of little trivia there too. Actually, another interesting piece of trivia, your FQDN, your fully qualified domain name for whatever your domain name is going to be, has to be less than, I believe, 64 characters. 64 characters or less in the entire length of the domain name. So if you start creating some ridiculous domain structures down here, you're eventually going to get limited by just the number of characters in the fully qualified domain name for that domain itself. So again, plenty of opportunity to kind of overthink the requirements here for this nugget, the objectives here. When you're talking about just building domains and implementing multi-domain, multi-forest, just be aware of what the reasons are, or what the permissions are that you need to have, and also some of the requirements you have to have, as it says here, for interoperability with previous versions of Active Directory. Now, this kind of takes us into what this second objective here is, about upgrading existing domains in Forest, including the environment protection and the functional levels, because the functional levels here kind of directly relates to what we think of as the previous versions of Active Directory. Let me show you the very short list of steps that is the upgrade process for getting a domain to the next level of Active Directory, the next functional level. There's just a couple of them, but you got to know what these are, because at some point you're actually going to need to accomplish this in your Active Directory management career. So let's look now at what the upgrade process is to upgrade either a domain or a forest. The first step in this process is just simply make sure that your domain and forest and the domain controllers in that forest are healthy. Make sure your domain controllers are patched. Make sure that they have healthy replication between them. We'll talk in an upcoming nugget when we talk about managing AD and sysvol replication about what the tools are you can use to manage that healthy replication. I would ensure that you have correct DNS records. We'll talk about what those DNS records are as well. And to make sure that your domain controllers are also correctly auto-registering their Active Directory records, or excuse me, their DNS records whenever you accomplish that. Look for event log warnings. Make sure you have backups of everything. The first step in any upgrade is to make sure you start with a really, really good, healthy domain first. The second step in the upgrade process is to actually what we call extend the schema. Now, in the old days, and really actually even until today, in the old days we only had one tool. That tool was a tool called AD Prep, or Active Directory Preparation Tool. Today we have this tool either independently or as part of the Active Directory, the ADDS configuration wizard, which is the little wizard that appears after you install Active Directory Directory Services onto a potential or a candidate domain controller. This AD Prep tool literally extends the schema. And when we say extends the schema, what we're literally doing is changing the structure of the Active Directory database. We need to do this with each upgrade because each upgrade of Active Directory adds new features, adds new functionality to Active Directory itself. And I'll show you what these differences are as we hear in just a minute. This AD Prep tool, which I will also show you here in just a minute, has three different main switches that you can run. You can either run AD Prep independently, or you can run it as part of the Active Directory Directory Services configuration wizard. So AD Prep gets your schema updated, and hold on to that for just another minute. I'll explain exactly how it works. Once you've upgraded the schema, your third step in here is perhaps the most arduous, and that is to upgrade all of your domain controllers. This is the process that can take the longest period of time. If you're one of those organizations that has 1,000 different sites and 1,000,000 different domain controllers, you can think about the somewhat awful task of getting every single domain controller in that domain or forest upgraded to the correct version. That's a lot of work. Now, thankfully, the replication that now occurs, the multi-master replication in Active Directory, makes this process quite a bit simpler than it was perhaps many years ago before we had Active Directory. we can literally just create a new domain controller, add it to the domain, and it will eventually replicate all the stuff that it needs in order to become a fully functioning domain controller. But you do have to go through all the important steps of getting those domain controllers upgraded, and that's really where you're going to spend most of your time. The fourth step, once you've accomplished that, or in tandem with accomplishing that, is moving any FSMO roles to their correct location. You've already talked in those previous tests in 410 or 411, I'm not sure, about the FSMO roles and how to either seize or transfer those onto new equipment or onto, if you end up upgrading onto the same equipment. So moving around the FSMO roles, if that's necessary, is the next step in the process. And then the last piece of this, the very last step in the process, is to actually raise, if I can spell here, the functional level of the domain. And it is not until you actually get to this step where you get to enjoy the benefits of having that upgraded domain. It is this fifth step that gets you all the new features that you're looking for in completing an Active Directory upgrade. Now, out of all of these steps in the process, there are two that I want to show you kind of just a little bit more information about. The first is this AD prep process, and the second has to do with the features that you get at the new functional levels. And the reason for this is because, whether or not it's on the test or not, it's the AD prep process, I think, for the non-technical people that we admins work for, is kind of like it can be the most scariest part. Especially when if you're an IT person, you walk in and you're like, look, we want to do an upgrade, and I need to extend the Active Directory schema. Now, if you're a non-technical person and someone walks in and says that they need to extend the Active Directory schema, that makes you uncomfortable. It feels like a really challenging thing. Well, it's really not. I mean, literally, we're just adding some new columns and attributes to the Active Directory database. So these days, with the people that I work with, I kind of tell them, try not to use the terms extend the Active Directory schema, because really what you're doing is just adding some columns. And perhaps that might be a little easier than using those very challenging and scary words like extending the schema. So let me actually show you where you can get access to some of the things that you'll need in order to accomplish this task. Let me pop over here with an elevated command prompt, and I want to go to Windows System 32 AD Prep. I told you that AD Prep is the tool that you use to extend the schema. This is the tool that's baked into that configuration wizard with Active Directory. AD Prep right here, if I type AD Prep with a question mark, oops, that's the wrong version of it. Interestingly enough, the AD Prep executable is not located on the server, even though all the schema files are. Let me go back here to the D drive, which I believe it's here in the support AD Prep location. Yes, okay. So a little interesting trivia here too. The DVD for Windows Server 2012 R2 has in the support AD Prep location this AD Prep tool, and the contents of this folder look really similar to what's on the C drive, except on the C drive of the system is not the file adprep.exe. I always thought that was pretty cool. It copies everything over except the actual tool to do what you actually want. Anyway, adprep.exe with the /? Switch shows you all sorts of different parameters that you can add in whenever you run the thing. The reality is that you're looking for 1, 2, 2.5, and then 3 of these switches that you need to add in order to accomplish something. So the first one of these is the /forest prep switch here, which, as you can imagine, is something that needs to be run one time per forest. So you run this one time on the forest. It attaches to the schema master for the forest and for the root domain of the forest, and then updates to add all of those additional columns and attributes to the Active Directory database to later on add new features. Once you've run it one time for the forest, you'll need then to run in each domain the /domain prep command. So if you have 4 forests or 4 domains, you're going to run it 4 times in 4 domains. Again, we're going to be running this typically on the schema master of the forest, and you're going to have schema master privileges in order to actually run these things. The domain prep /gp prep switch is used, as you can see here, to update permissions on group policy objects. You run that on the infrastructure role master after forest prep is finished. And then optionally down here is one called RODC prep, which is designed or which is used only if you intend on implementing read-only domain controllers in your forest. There's some additional stuff that has to get created, a replication part or a replica partition that has to be created in order for RODCs to accomplish their job. And so you'll run this anytime that you have domains that are going to end up deploying read-only domain controllers. This very minor and also very optional switch that you'll need to set. Now, a lot of people are at this point fairly familiar with what these switches are. Running AD prep is necessary so that you can just accomplish this process. The entire process takes not that long of a period of time. However, when you do execute these commands, it is very important that you execute the commands slowly or in a very stepwise fashion. Now, the reason for this is because if you have a very large domain or a very large forest, there is a process by which the contents that have been changed, whenever you run the command, you've added attributes to the database or you've added columns to the database, that process to get the content spread throughout your forest can take a relatively long period of time. If you've got multiple sites set up and you've got your site links set up to only replicate information at certain times of the day, another thing that we'll talk about in an upcoming nugget on sites and site links, you just kind of want to wait a while between executing the first of these commands up here and then executing any of the down level commands afterwards. It's a great idea to run it, maybe wait a couple hours or a couple of days and then execute the next ones so that you don't end up having any confusion in the replication that occurs. Now, in working with a lot of different clients over the years, I find that the actual schema update process that AD prep actually executes is one of those kind of black boxes that people never really have kind of figured out exactly what happens. And as a consequence, I think far too many people kind of get stuck in their change control process in justifying exactly what the Active Directory preparation process is going to do. Well, let me actually point you to the exact files that get executed by this AD prep command so that when somebody else in your change control board tells you, I need to know exactly what you're about to do so it doesn't compete or conflict with some of the changes that I may have made, you can hand them these files so that they can peruse them for themselves, or you can review these files with them. If you come here into the C drive on a domain controller, to the Windows folder, and then to the System32 subfolder, and we're looking for the AD prep subfolder here, you'll notice that there are a variety of LDF files that are found here, up to SCH69. These LDF files are human readable files that are exactly the changes that are occurring as you go about executing these forest prep and domain prep activities. And the LDF files will execute in sequence, so you'll know that the earlier LDF files execute before the later LDF files will. If I take a look at one of these files, I can actually view them, for example, here in Notepad, and you can see exactly what these files are attempting to accomplish. So here is the distinguished name of the change that we want to make. In DC=X, our domain name, the configuration container, the schema subcontainer, resource MSDS members of resource property list. We're going to do some sort of addition to the schema. The object class is an attribute. Here's the display name for the object. Here is a short description of the object we're adding, an ID, and so on and so on and so on. Once we're done with that, we move on to the next one, and then on to the next one, and then we keep committing each of these changes as part of this schema update. Now, I don't want to go through the specifics of exactly what these things are because these are very important. If you've got developers, for example, that have made actual changes to the Active Directory schema and may be concerned that your schema updates may interfere with their schema updates. But I do want to make you aware that these LDF files do exist. You can find them in this location on any domain controller, and they are handy, absolutely handy, when it comes time to try to get your Active Directory upgrade through your change control process. So once we've accomplished that, once we've gone through the process of extending the schema, once we've gone through the process of upgrading all the domain controllers to that new version, we can then complete this process by raising the functional level of the domain. And actually raising the functional level is a remarkably simple thing to do. I told you that the schema extension is in many ways kind of the hard part because you got to get that through. The actual raising of the functional level is more or less a single mouse click. If I go here under Tools to Active Directory Domains and Trusts, I love this little item up here that says Raise Functional Forest Level. And as the very last step in the process of completing a domain or forest upgrade, in this case, this is the location where you will raise the functional level for the forest from whatever its existing level is to the new level. Now, I can't do that here because I'm already at 2012 R2, but if I could, I would see the item here to click the button and complete the raising of the functional level. Again, we don't actually get any of those nice features until we complete this last step. So this is where all the magic really happens. The forest level is raised here. The domain functional level is raised here. Both of these need to be set to the same level, Windows Server 2012, Windows Server 2012 R2, in order to support the new features that one gets with those functional levels. I would, for the exam, be very aware of each of the functional levels and what new features are supported at each of those new domain and forest functional levels. There are certain features that are enabled at the domain functional level and certain features that are enabled at the forest functional level, and they have historically made very common test questions here. For the domain functional levels, each new functional level provides new functionality, starting even with Windows 2000, 2003, 2008, and so on. The early ones were kind of past, so I'll skip past those for now. But I think you should be aware of the fact that when we move to, for example, to Windows Server 2008, that we gained a few new really exciting features, some of which are, and I'm pointing these out because we'll actually be working with a few of these later, the fact that our sysfile can be replicated no longer with the FRS, the file replication services, but actually distributed file system, a much better replication solution. If your domain and forest are below Windows Server 2008, you're running on an ancient replication solution, and you're going to want to get yourself up to DFS to replicate your sysfile. We'll talk more about that when we get into the replicating sysfile nugget upcoming. DFS-in is supported in 2008, so DFS namespaces is supported. Better encryption for the Kerberos protocol, and better auditing with last interactive logon information here with Windows Server 2008. I would be aware too of these nice new fine-grained password policies and the password settings objects that you will use for implementing FGPPs. Fine-grained password policies are awesome for being able to create different policies for different people in an organization. So one person needs to change their password every 90 days and somebody else every 30 days. This is a nice feature that you get with Windows Server 2008. 2008 supported personal virtual desktops if you want to plan on doing VDI. We got additional authentication assurance here, so the abilities to package up to get more information about how a user actually authenticated. Was it with a password or was it with a smart card? Do we get managed service accounts here in Windows Server 2008 R2? Managed service accounts make the process of dealing with service accounts much easier. And so having those is nice, and one of the great benefits we get when we upgrade to 2008 R2. Upgrading from Windows 2008 R2 to Windows Server 2012 adds some additional authentication functionality to Kerberos that we will make use of when we start implementing technologies like ADFS, Federation Services, or Dynamic Access Control. A lot of the things you're seeing here, you're going to see again as we start working on the configuration of DAC and ADFS. So you have to have your domain at Windows Server 2012 if you're going to use these technologies. And lastly, with this newest version, with 2012 R2, we get some new domain controller side protections for this special class of users called protected users, or users that we want to ensure are integrated or interfacing with our environment in only very specific ways, to protect those users, to ensure that they're coming in via the ways that we want. And then also authentication policies, which again we'll be dealing with, and also the policy silos down here, that we'll be dealing with a little bit later on when we start talking about these added security functions that we want to build into our domain as part of this 70-412 series. So again, I would be absolutely aware of what all of these different functions are because they just tend to be common test questions. Now, whereas with each domain functional level, there are some pretty nifty new features that you get. With the Forest functional levels, anything past, let's see here, 2008 R2 gets you really not much at all. Once you get to Windows Server 2008 R2, you get the Active Directory recycle bin, which is nice. Being able to recover accidentally or maliciously deleted Active Directory objects is definitely a bonus in my book. But after that, there's really nothing new that happens in 2012 or 2012 R2. This is specifically to a Forest upgrade. So that takes us to, I think, 2 of the 3 different items that we want to talk about here in this nugget. The third has to do with configuring multiple UPN suffixes. And this is one of those features that it can actually be kind of cool, particularly if you have a forest or multiple forests that you intend on connecting together and you want to have a simple structure for your users. So UPN suffixes are a mechanism to change the actual logon that a user uses when they're logging into an account. So for example, here on my computer here, let me actually minimize this and let me log out so I can show you how this works. Most of us in IT are used to a particular structure for how we set up our logins, this domain name / username structure that we have. But it is indeed possible for us to use a different structure like username @ domain name. Now, there's everything that exists past the @ sign that is what we consider to be a user principal name. This looks like an email address. In fact, this could potentially be your email address, but it has absolutely nothing to do with email at all. We're using this as an authentication mechanism just for the user's username in order to log on to the domain. If I punch in my password here, I'll log in as gshields@company.pri. But occasionally there comes the time when you may want to implement the username @ domain name approach for logons, but you might want a different second half of that process. Maybe instead of gshields@company.pri, I'd prefer to have gshields@company.com. Well, the process to accomplish that is done by configuring another or multiple user principal name suffixes. And the way that you accomplish that happens again back here in Active Directory Domains and Trusts. If I come here and I look at the properties of the root node up here and view this UPN suffixes tab here. This alternate UPN suffixes is a way for me to, again, change what goes on at the other side of the @ sign. So maybe I want to put company.com as an alternate UPN suffix for any of the users that are logging on to this domain or forest. This is most commonly implemented when environments are attempting to map their on-premise logons with their Office 365 logons. You'll see this happening, especially when we start talking about federation again, when we start synchronizing our Office 365 content to our local content. That's where you see it most often in the wild today. Once I accomplish that, then the second step in the process is to actually just change the configuration on each user object. So if I come over here to Active Directory Users and Computers and then go to my user account, I can change my the second half of my user logon from @company.pri now to @company.com. So this just makes things easier for users if they're used to a common email address and you want to map one thing to the other. But again, remember, these have nothing to do with email addresses other than making it feel more like the email address for the individual user. So what have we talked about this nugget? We have talked about configuring a forest or a domain and making sure to focus ourselves in on specifically the types of things we have to know for this exam. We talked about things we need to be aware of when it comes time for multi-domain and multi-forest environments. You've already done the creation and the installation of an Active Directory domain controller, so seeing that again isn't awesome, but knowing when you would go about creating multiple domain or multiple forest environments is particularly important. We also talked about the steps, the 5-step process that's necessary to upgrade an existing domain or forest, including all those bits that prepare that environment for that all-important final click to upgrade the functional level. And we concluded with a quick look here at configuring multiple UPN suffixes. So if you are an environment that wants to map your email address to your Active Directory domain, or if you want to map your Office 365 accounts to your Active Directory accounts, you can accomplish that by setting a different UPN suffix. Coming up next, I've hinted towards a couple of the additional things that we need to talk about here with domain controllers and Active Directory. I hinted towards trusts. I hinted towards sites and configuring sites. And I also talked a bit about replication, both with Active Directory and with sysvol. And those three items are what's coming up here in the next couple of nuggets. But first, we're going to spend a little time talking about trusts and how we take these multiple domains or multiple forests and connect them together so that we can accomplish the sharing of resources across these different domain and forest structures. That's the topic for our next nugget, so until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.